Whoso explores the river will find one continuous force whose antiquity seems to vie with creation, where the sun cannot enter till there is opened a passage. Where is the man so hardy or so mad as to settle alone in such a horrid wild, so far from all human assistance and through much suffering?
Horrid wild? That's how it seemed to Halliburton as he made his way up the Kennecook River in 1780. Still, he persevered, and 240 years later, people are still choosing to make their homes in East Hants. Situated in the center of mainland Nova Scotia, Canada, East Hants today is a diverse mix of people, communities, and geography. The southeastern portion is often called the Corridor. Enfield, Elmsdale, Lance, Milford, Shubenacadie, and the Sibaganegatee First Nation. The central part of East Hants is still a vast forest, and within it, the villages of Kennecook, Gore, Rawdon, Mount Uniacke, and more. Against the northern shore of East Hants is the Minas Basin. The people of Walton, Knoll, and Maitland call this unique shoreline home. The place has a rich history.
I think history is absolutely important. There's thousands of students, ex-students out there who would say, yeah, he'd say that, but yeah, everyone should know about it. And especially in East Hants now, where there are so many new people moving in, I think it becomes even more important that they understand, you know, this is us, this is who we are.
The natural resources of East Hants brought people here thousands of years ago. The first to call this place home were the indigenous people, the Mi'kmaq.
They were sort of semi-nomadic, so they moved with the seasons, and so they lived along the Cobequid Bay shoreline. They came upriver and settled as far as Enfield. That's part of the reason why there's a street there named Arrowhead Drive, because a lot of artifacts have been found right out by Grand Lake. Really, the only evidence of sort of a semi-permanent settlement was in Shubenacadie.
The area would have been commonly known by its traditional name, Sibaganegatee. The Agadi always referring to place, place of, place at.
In Mi'kmaq, Sibaganegatee means abounding in ground nuts, or place where the wild potato grows, and refers to the prized edible root which was plentiful along the banks of the river.
4,000 to 5,000 years of history on that river. That's why cultural memory is so important, I think, because I see it here in all these things.
The Nova Scotia Museum has an impressive collection of Mi'kmaq artifacts from the Shubenacadie area. This quill box is their work. A wooden bottom, bark insert, spruce root bands, and a decorative quill top. The Mi'kmaq fashioned mats and baskets from white and black ash.
Our popple flowers, some of the great flower makers were out of Shubenacadie. The late Mrs. Brooks, Mrs. Madeline Knockwood. Very beautiful work. Little moccasins, you'll see the beadwork, typical of Mi'kmaq style, mid-1800s. But here is a peaked hat. You'll see that in traditional paintings, etc. It was a formal woman's hat that just sat down over the head. This would be the back. This would be the front. The quality of work is just incredible. There's probably some of the earliest artifacts are a number of groundstone tools. You'll see an old pipe, the bowl, the stem here. The history in that Shubenacadie River is thousands of years. The attraction of those rivers is the overlapping availability of resources on them. You're never wanting for resources.
The Acadians began in the Annapolis Valley with the first settlement there in 1605 by Samuel de Champlain. And gradually, the settlements, as they developed the land and farmed it and whatnot, they progressively moved along the rivers and the shores, made their way to New Minas, made their way to what is now Windsor, back then was called Pisiquid, and then eventually moved along to the shores of East Hants. It took them between 1605 and 1710 before they finally got to the first settlement that they developed in East Hants, which was Knoll.
The Acadians enjoyed many benefits from the friendship of the Mi'kmaq people. It allowed for the peaceful expansion of Acadian settlement, and so the newcomers settled here into a quiet farming life. They planted fruit trees and crops. They built dikes, some of which can still be seen today, 300 years after they were built.
The very good thing about the Acadians coming to Nova Scotia was they brought some skills with them, and excuse me. Come on, Peg. Shh. Peggy's a Canadian. Between 1640 and 1700, Louis XIV sent horses to New France. They're Canada's national breed. These are the descendants. The Acadians brought skills with them, certainly, and coming to a part of the country that had high tides. The marshlands were the easiest land for them to develop. There was no forest for them to cut.
There was a settlement called Prie-à-Briard, which is basically in what is now Selma. Then they moved on to the Maitland area, which was Ville-Robert. And although it's on the Colchester side of the Shubenacadie River, they did establish one in what is now the confluence of the Stewiacke and Shubenacadie rivers, and founded a settlement there called Ibert.
And those communities really grew quite quickly. There was a large population of Acadians, at the time of the expulsion.
In August 1754, Governor Charles Lawrence of Nova Scotia, acting for the British government, sent an expedition around Grand Lake and down the length of the Shubenacadie River. They were to locate Mi'kmaq and Acadian settlements in preparation for the expulsion of the Acadians a year later. But during that year, the Acadians of East Hants escaped to Tatamagouche and Prince Edward Island. Although those at Prie-à-Briard, now Selma, were captured and deported by the British in an act still remembered here for its cruelty. Most of their cleared lands were given to New England planters from Cobequid, now Truro, and to Scots and Irish settlers. In 1783, the American Revolutionary War ended, and with that came a massive migration of Loyalists to Nova Scotia.
There were two basic groups of Loyalists that settled in East Hants. The first one was actually a regiment, a British regiment. They were granted lands. Their colonel, John Small, got them a grant of land in basically central East Hants.
Loyalists from South Carolina were granted lands in Rawdon Township, and disbanded soldiers of the 84th Regiment were granted lands in Douglas Township, the area that now comprises virtually all of Hants North and the 9 Mile River Valley. The 2nd Battalion of the 84th Regiment was a Highland regiment of the British Army, comprised of captured Scottish migrants and some men of German extraction. Their descendants still live in East Hants. MacDonnell, MacDonald, McPhee, Miller, Ettinger, Henniger, and Blois are common names. The Loyalists of Rawdon and Douglas settled and got to work building East Hants.
I look at settlement in East Hants because it is from the outside in, because this area was settled first, because it was accessible, the water was the highway. Many of them didn't stay. They went elsewhere where the work had already been done and where they had families, where they could settle in with far less difficulty than carving an existence out of a wilderness, which is what East Hants was. The people who stayed there, like the Thompsons and the McPhees, all of those people, they had to be made of some solid stuff. and they had large families, and they buried large families. It wasn't easy. And what East Hants is today is a testament to that kind of pig-headed determination, I think is the best way to put it.
New townships were founded in the early 1800s. 9 Mile River, Maitland, Shubenacadie, Walton, and Uniacke among them.
When it came time to develop things like schools and churches, it was a nice progressive line of townships that were developed. Shubenacadie Township, believe it or not, was one of the last ones. And yet it would eventually grow into be almost like the Shire town of East Hants.
Given its growing population and its sheer size, Hants County was divided in 1861 into 2 districts, West Hants and East Hants. The term municipality wasn't used until decades later.
The one thing that we don't often think about when we talk about agriculture is that practically every farm had a forest and had woodland. They burned wood and, to heat their homes. People talked about cutting enough timber to pay their taxes. I mean, their wood lot was money. When other things on the farm didn't go well, you kind of had access to a bit of an income if you needed it there to get you through the tough times. And forestry in Nova Scotia was used for that.
Forestry has been a very important part of East Hants for 200 years. This is a white pine. This tree is about 150 years old. Some of these live to be 250, 300 years old.
Meet Downey Thompson. Downey was 10 years old when he went to work with his father in the woods in Renfrew. He's a member of Nova Scotia's Forestry Hall of Fame. It's been written of Downey that if you cut him open, he'd bleed sap.
I've been involved in forestry all my life, and that's all I really know. And my great-grandfather had a sawmill back here in 1856. And this, what we're looking at today, is a typical Acadian forest. And it was income to the settlers and fuel wood. There was great demand for lumber at that time. Life was pretty tough, but we didn't know any difference. We stayed in the woods and the lumber camps all week and sometimes all winter. And there was a cookhouse and bunkhouse, and you got your meals there, and you went out in the woods to work, and it was all manual, horses and axes, and there were some great workers in them times, very dedicated, hard work. Sleeping in the bunkhouse is, you could be 50, 60 men in the same room, and one big old stove, and going to bed, you'd be roasting hot. By the time you woke up, you'd be freezing. And but that was the way of life. Forestry was a very important industry, and it's a renewable industry. We can keep it going.
These are the tools, these kinds of tools in the lumbering industry and in the forest, in the agricultural world as well, and the shipbuilding, that built East Hants.
In the era of wooden ships and iron men, Nova Scotia was building a reputation for shipbuilding. Canada was the world's 5th largest owner of ships, and almost half of those ships were built and owned in Nova Scotia. Selma became a shipbuilding hub. Between 1860 and 1885, 30 ships were built here. Today, Lower Selma is the summer home of the East Hants Historical Society's museum, located in the former United Church.
All the way from Urbania to Walton, there were a number of shipbuilding yards, and the early settlement along this shore came here not to build ships, they came to farm. But you have to remember too that you don't have to go very far inland before you're into dense Acadian forest at that time. With the access to the ocean and the trees. Shipbuilding became sort of the natural next step, you might say.
Shipbuilding prospered along the shore. In Knoll was the Osmond O'Brien shipyard. 20 ships were built here and went to sea under Nova Scotian master mariners. Maitland is a special place today. This village too has prospered because of shipbuilding, and the shipwrights and masters built stately homes too. The tides in this part of the Bay of Fundy were perfect for launching ships. The highest tides in the world were measured right here in East Hants, just down the road at Burnt Coat Head. The Fundy tide there has risen as high as 16.3 meters, or 53.5 feet, the height of a 5-story building. Rafting, as the rising tide sweeps up the Shubenacadie River, is great fun. This is Friesen Roy, in the middle of Maitland. It's said to be Canada's oldest general store, and its wares have served people here for generations. We were honored to have been shown this. It's the store's original sales desk and ledger, which were here during the Age of Sail. Among the names in the ledger is William Lawrence, who was designer, builder, and owner of the William D. Lawrence, the largest wooden ship ever built in Canada. The keel was laid in the winter of 1872. Construction took 2 years, and the ship was launched October 7th, 1874. Lawrence's house, now a museum, is a popular landmark in Maitland.
The shipbuilding really drove the economy. There was money, there was a lot of money, and it was an ephemeral thing in the sense that you didn't have to lose very many ships before the money went too. I mean, we look at this little ship's organ, fondly named Jenny, belonged to the captain's wife of the Milton. Well, the Milton sank, it caught fire and sank off the coast of the United States, the Pacific coast. It was saved because the ship's captain's wife refused to leave the ship without Jenny. But these are representative of the fine living lifestyle. And to do that, you had to have money. The rest of us were farmers and laborers who would have filled the shipyards and provided the labor force that was necessary to do that kind of work. And it was the same with the logging industry. And it was the same with the gypsum industry. The gypsum was dug, literally, out of the ground and carted to South Maitland, where it was put on a barge and barged down to Maitland, where it was then put on a ship and taken off to the United States or England, whichever.
Here was a natural resource that was present in a location that was accessible. And the ability for people to get work and make some money was so important in a world where that wasn't always easy. So at that time, they could get work, and if it wasn't, within a reasonable distance of a particular community, you developed a community around the mine.
Mining, too, has left its mark on this place. John Graham opened the White Rock Quarry Mine in Maitland in the early 19th century. The gypsum industry would contribute much to the growth of East Hants. South Maitland was actually known as Rockville for a time because of its gypsum deposits and quarries. The Walton Barite Mine was southwest of Walton, just inside the West Hants boundary. Sturgeon gold mines began drilling in 1940, and this became the largest barite quarry and mine in Canada. In 1970, a blast opened a fault and flooded the mine with water from the Minas Basin. The mine closed in 1978. Once it had accounted for 90% of the barite produced in Canada and was one of the largest deposits in the world. From the mid-1880s until the end of World War I, an antimony, or as some say, antimony mine, operated in West Gore. During the war, West Gore was Canada's largest producer of antimony, which is used in alloys to make other metals harder, important for shell casings. Other quarries in the Walton area cut into one of the largest gypsum deposits in Nova Scotia. Gypsum was trucked from the Jenison Pit Mine, Whale Creek Mine, and Stevens Mine to Walton and shipped mainly to the United States. Gold was also found in Mount Uniacke, on the farm of Nova Scotia's then Attorney General, Richard Uniacke. The mine operated until 1941, and it produced 27,000 ounces of gold. Uniacke's estate still exists. It's a Nova Scotia museum site. In 1861, John McPhee, William Thompson, and Andrew Parker discovered gold in Renfrew, close to Enfield. It was said that from the waters of the Free Claim Brook, a year's wages could be made in a day.
Renfrew was a community that developed around the gold resource, and it drew people for a number of years, created work for a number of years. My great-grandfather was one of those people, and his brother, and they actually noticed gold in what I grew up calling the Free Claim Brook, but is, I think on the maps, it's the Meadow River.
At the height of the gold rush, Renfrew had 700 residents. In 1864, they opened a new direct road from Enfield Station to Renfrew. E.H. Horne was a prospector and a breeder of Hereford cattle who panned for gold in Renfrew and got rich. He and his wife Anna did much for the community of Enfield. In 1943, Horne built a school. He presented the deed to the school to the community at the opening ceremony. The school still stands. It houses some businesses and the E.H. Horne School Preservation Society. Edmund and Anna are buried across the street.
In East Hants, gold was number one because you had Renfrew, Rod and Gold Mines, Mount Uniacke were kind of three that come to mind quite easily. The Barite Mine in Walton, which is actually in Hants West, the location, but certainly the impact on the people of East Hants, because a lot of the town of Walton really was generated with money from there. Similar thing with National Gypsum. I mean, you have a gypsum mine that's across the border in the next municipality, but the impact on East Hants was significant. It was treasured, I think, and people talk nostalgically about the time when a mine operated and the impact on the community, and they did not perceive it as a negative thing. It was seen as a really positive, the good time.
Travel is easier today than it used to be in East Hants. In the early years, roads were mud tracks and often impassable, but the construction of new roads was extremely hard labor. Until 1894, road work was done with pick and shovel and with horses and oxen for the heavy loads. That year, East Hants acquired 3 American champion road machines. One was allotted to Shubie Maitland, one to Gore 9 Mile River, and one to the Rawdon-Uniacke area. Roads, bridges, and wharves were constructed in the late 1800s and early 1900s to better connect towns and villages. The first ferry across the Shubenacadie River crossed between Maitland and Black Rock in Colchester County. The ferry was described as a suitable boat for ferrying passengers, horses, and freight, and later cars as well.
When you think about the contribution that men and women of East Hants have made to the various military conflicts of the 20th century, we do have a large number of the kinds of artifacts that you'd expect to see in relation to people who did serve. The Miller brothers, they went to the United States and fought for the Americans during the Spanish-American War. And of course, their nephews, Jack and Harry Miller, both served during World War II. And Harry, this is Harry's uniform here. He was a member of the Princess Patricia's Light Infantry during the Korean conflict. And this is a death penny. It is labeled, He Died for Freedom and Honor, Laurie Chalmers Putnam. This particular book was the Bible that Roy Dawes, Private Roy Dawes from Renfrew, carried. During World War I, East Hants sent a number of women functioning as nurses, nursing sisters, Helen Whidden, Claire Gass. We have here the parchment certificate from Dalhousie University that was awarded to Annie Henniger on the receipt of her Doctoris Medicinae et Magistri Chirurgiae in Latin. She was one of the first female doctors in East Hants. She and two other women, actually, Jean Whittier and Eliza Bryson, all received doctorates. She doctored up and down the shore all her career. This book I particularly wanted to show you since we talked about her earlier, and this, of course, is the War Diary of Claire Gass. She's the person to whom John McCrae showed his poem, In Flanders Fields, and said, "What do you think of that?" And she said, "You better send it off and get it published." And the rest is history, as they say.
The Intercolonial Railway arrived about mid-century. The Midland Line between Truro and Windsor opened in 1899. Gold mining in Renfrew and Oldham drove the construction of the Intercolonial. The railway meant growth for the Enfield-Elmsdale area and opportunity for businesses other than farming and forestry, such as pottery and brickmaking. The Midland, later renamed the Dominion Atlantic Railway, was built on lumber money, but became a freight and milk train, stopping at every village on its route. Eventually, modern highways would make the DAR redundant.
For East Hants, if there's one thing we can do, we can grow grass. And anything that can live on forages, ruminants in particular, which would be cattle, dairy and beef, and sheep, these have provided a real incentive for people to go into those areas.
Through the years, agriculture was a mainstay. Cold, wet springs and clay soils allowed East Hants farmers to grow incredible quantities of grass. Life on the farm improved greatly in the 20th century. Electricity, The internal combustion engine, hydraulics, and refrigeration altered everything. Small dairies and cheese plants opened to serve the needs of farmers. One was the Little River Cheese Manufacturing Company at a spot still called Cheese Factory Corner on Highway 14. Another cheese factory opened in East Knoll in 1893. A third dairy was Elm Avenue Dairy in Elmsdale.
East Hants produces a third. The dairy sector in East Hants produces a third of the milk produced in the province today. Although blueberries, which we know are a couple of years ago, were Nova Scotia's largest horticultural crop. And we do have, significant blueberry production.
Dutch immigrants to Canada after World War II brought a new energy to agriculture in East Hants. Dutch families found land and new opportunity in East Knoll, Milford, Shubenacadie, and Hardwood Lands areas.
In Europe, post-war, there was a lot of interest in farming, but the land was quite scarce. So the Canadian government was, I understood, they were promoting agriculture in Canada and all the wonderful opportunities, and to an eager bunch of young Dutch fellows that were willing to uproot and bring their families here. So, well, it was in Vermeulen, Boekmes, Versteegs, Folkertsmas, Vandenhof, Van de Vrie, Hybers, Vissers. These are all, people that, that were all young farmers at the same time. It's a hard scrabble bunch, and they worked hard, and as kids we had to work hard also because, they were just trying to get established and get ahead. And, it's, I guess, that way either you loved it or you hated it, and probably you hated it, but then you end up loving it. So once they left Europe, it was very difficult to go back. They didn't want to come back as, defeated, or they wanted to come back as a success.
Each of our communities has a story. In 1899, three brothers, Harvey, Croft, and Dick Lance, moved to Elmsdale from Lunenburg. They cleared land and began making bricks. Brickyards and potteries provided employment for many. For the clay here was soft, red, and free of stones. At the outset, bricks were made by hand and dried in the sun. Only later were kilns used. So East Hants became known for brickyards and potteries too. Many of the buildings of Halifax were made of brick from Enfield Elmsdale. In Lance, homes for workers at the brick plants were made of brick too. In 1942, a school was built in Lance, made of brick, of course. The building is gone now, but in this old school photo, people from East Hants may recognize some familiar faces, including a young Keith Miller. The brick-making industry has thrived. Today, the Lance plant, now part of the Shaw Group, is the only clay brick plant in Atlantic Canada, and also makes concrete pipe and blocks. Initially, the Shubenacadie River and canal system carried the heavy loads of brick and lumber to Halifax. The arrival of rail diminished the need for the Shubenacadie Canal. This is Lock 6 on the canal at Horn Settlement. It was built in 1857. The stone walls of the loch remain, and if you look carefully, you can see remnants of an upper gate just below the surface of the water. Enfield became a village in 1862. It was named at a public meeting held at Malcolm's Pottery in this building. Thomas Donaldson suggested the village be named after his hometown of Enfield in the Connecticut River Valley. The building still stands near the entrance to Alderney Drive. Like Enfield, Elmsdale owes its early settlement and growth to the canal and railroad. Brickmakers, potters, leather workers, shoemakers, blacksmiths, railway hands, carpenters, and clerks all found employment on the 2-mile stretch between Enfield and Elmsdale. Not to mention those who worked in the woods and on farms. And the women who cleaned, churned, cooked, quilted, and raised children. In 1858, the main line to Truro went through the community we now know as Milford. Because of that rail connection, the name Milford Station was also used. Before that, it was called Wickwire Station, after the original settlers, the Wickwire family. In 1870, John Wardrope suggested the name Milford. People felt that was appropriate as a lumber mill was erected near the fording place on the river, Mill Ford. Milford had a small post office, and for weary travelers, a hotel. This lovely tree-lined road can be found in West Gore. In Gore, you'll also find Courthouse Hill. A courthouse stood here for 90 years until destroyed by fire in 1954. The view is terrific. On a clear day, you can see 5 counties. This area is also well known for its blueberries. This village is on the old trail from Knoll to Halifax. It's Kennecook, and in 1919, a branch of the Bank of Nova Scotia opened here. Before power lines passed through Kennecook, hotel guests wanted light. A solution was found.
Now I'm going to flick a switch. Can you see the light? That's the generator that ran the lights in the old Kennecook Hotel before the power went through the village. And it's a 32-volt DC generator, powered all the lights in the hotel. This is a generator that provided power to the village of Knoll. Cyril Parks ran it with a turbine, and whenever he needed water, he had a dam up brook. He would phone up and someone would open the dam, the water would go down, the turbine would run, and every night. And these are the big switches. He'd throw these switches to give power. But it's a unique piece of history.
If it had a motor, or was water or steam powered and was used in East Hants, this man knows about it.
The old hotel, the fellow that owned the old hotel, he had 7 sawmills running at one time, Marston Anthony. They're all steam engines.
Craig Anthony runs Blast from the Past Heritage Society in Kennecook. He has quite a collection of antique tractors, steam engines, and other machinery from days gone by.
11-foot diameter wheel, and weighs about 4 ton. The engine weighs another 4 ton, so it's big.
This huge steam engine was half buried in mud when Craig found it. It was used to run a line shaft in a woodworking shop. This is a stamp mill used to crush rock and ore at a gold mine in Rawdon. If you think your summer job is hot and noisy, imagine running this behemoth 100 years ago when it was steam-powered. Shubenacadie grew quickly, with some stately homes, a tannery, a carriage shop, and a hardware store. Shubenacadie also had daily mail service and 2 hotels. This handsome building is from the 1890s. It was given to the community and is now a museum.
I'm Betty Stonehouse, and I'm the manager of the Tinsmith Museum. This building was built in 1895 by Watson Smith, who came from the Amherst area, and he was watching the milk cans being thrown off the trains, and they were all beaten, battered, and he said, I can make a better tin can than that. So he sold his business in Amherst area, and he moved here and built this facility. And he built it in 3 sections, and he did that because his oldest son, Cullen, became very interested in hardware. And the first shop became the hardware store, and so he built onto that. And then as the hardware expanded, they built onto it the 3rd time, and that's the actual Tin Shop Museum. Harry himself, which was the younger son, took over from his dad, the metalworking, and he's built over 80,000 cans out of this facility. And during the Halifax explosion, they built 8,000 cans to supply the creameries in Halifax. It's just like somebody walked out, closed the door, and almost a century later, you can come back in and see what it actually looked like. Every day you're in here, you will learn a new story about something in this place. It's just incredible. It's fun.
Halifax International Airport, now the Robert L. Stanfield Airport, is just 4 kilometers from Enfield. It opened September 10th, 1960. That year, 180,000 passengers used the airport. That rose to almost 4 million passengers in 2017. The airport resulted in rapid population growth in the East Hants corridor, which continues today. It's meant employment and important economic spin-offs for the area. Sports and recreation have made life in East Hants more vibrant. Hockey and baseball, of course, but also dances, concerts, and car and horse racing, too, have all been popular over the years. Green Acres Raceway, a quarter-mile dirt oval in 9 Mile River, operated from the early to the late 1960s. Maitland Dragway operated from 1966 to the early 2000s. And Maitland Raceway operated on and off from the 1950s to the 1990s. Racing had begun here with harness racing, There was winter harness racing too on Knoll Lake, Maitland Mill Pond, and Snides Lake. Church groups, lodges, Freemasons, temperance groups, dances, card parties, and sports all offered the people of East Hants opportunities to gather and socialize. The story of East Hants is one of hard work by hopeful people. Farming and forestry still prosper here. Shipbuilding, though, is mostly a memory. The place is still changing, still growing. Today it faces new issues arising from the fast-growing city nearby. But this beautiful area of Nova Scotia remains what it has always been, a welcoming place for families looking to the future.
What people did before us needs to be remembered. Museums like this one are one of the most important ways that remembering can happen.
For me, I think the fact that my family has deep roots here. I'm someone who is a descendant of someone who made a living mining and was involved in agriculture, and I think I've been really fortunate to have come as a product of that experience.
For me as a Mi'kmaq person, to go down to that river and stand on its bank kind of evokes a memory, right? And that's that cultural memory we talk about. And cultural memory is about continuity. That's why I say it's a very unique place in Nova Scotia, and it's there's very few places that have that quality of story, just unparalleled. I really honestly believe that.
For me, it's the people. The people who settled here are the most important part of the history to me. I mean, the old adage, those who are ignorant of the past are doomed to repeat it. You know, I've been retired for 7 years, but I still read history, I still research history, and I think, yeah, everyone should know about it. And, you know, I think the more we learn about each other, the better we will be as people.